Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative, and we're glad you can join us for our first webinar of 2021, which is titled Collaborative Science in a Virtual World, Part 2, Collaborating Around Multiple Stressors. If you can ignore the title slide, the title is wrong, but we did change the title right up at the last second as we were having our internal discussions. So sorry for the curveball to anybody who came here thinking it was a different webinar. It's the same webinar, just with a slightly revised title, but okay. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a national network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment, and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs. For today's webinar, all attendees are muted upon entry. We'll be handling questions via the question feature on the webinar console. We'll have time to answer questions after the discussion segment of today's webinar, but we do encourage you, as always, to submit them as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the webinar console. And we'll share a open access document as well for people to, in a little bit, for people to share their thoughts and resources at any point during the webinar. But before we move any further, we'll just take a quick moment to look at who registered for today's webinar. So here's a quick look at the registration breakdown for today's audience. And as always, we are very impressed with the large range of diverse organizations and regions who take an interest in our webinars. And we hope you all feel welcome. We hope you continue to engage with us. So a quick overview of what today's webinar looks like. It's broken down into 3 main sections. In the first section, each panelist will have about 5 minutes to provide some opening remarks. And then we'll move into a second section, which is a moderator discussion, and we'll end with Q&A. So on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome back Doug George as the moderator for today's webinar session. Doug is a trained geological oceanographer and the Science Collaborative's program manager at NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. He has worked throughout the West Coast as a federal scientist, state resource manager, and environmental consultant with projects ranging from estuary restoration and living shorelines to regional sediment management and climate change adaptation. And with that, I will pass it to you, Doug.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nick. I am very happy to come back and do this part 2 of our series. And thank you all for joining us for wherever you are. I think if you attended our December series, you'll know that we did a little bit of reflection of how the pandemic affected our work last year. Today we're going to go forward in time and look to what have we learned, where are we going. But before I kind of get too far into the weeds, just want to take kind of a bigger view for a moment. Last year, when the pandemic changed our world, we all became really rapid learners of how to do virtual work. That included collaboration efforts, which traditionally, of course, have relied upon in-person interactions and relationship building. And really relevant to that is in this challenging environment. There was a workshop a few years ago that the Science Collaborative hosted, and it was focused on how to advance successes in collaborative research. And could we get that link to the workshop report in the chat from Nick or Lynn? I think there's some really great information in this workshop report if you're interested, but I'll just summarize really highly that there are 3 big areas of exploration in that workshop, and that are very relevant to today's conversation. And those questions were: what factors enable end-user focused collaborative science, and what are the important ingredients of that? The second area of exploration was: what challenges do you encounter and anticipate encountering with end-user driven collaborative research? And then a third area that was explored in this workshop was looking at strategies for funding agencies and funders on how to conduct this kind of work. Now, with the virtual world changing everything that we were doing, the answers to those questions really evolved quite rapidly, and those answers are still being figured out. So we're going to hear from today, our panelists, that there's a lot to reflect on from the past, but more so, how do we go forward, and what have we learned enough of how to do collaborative research in a virtual world that we can look to the future, to not just immediate in the near term, but also medium and longer term. How have things changed fundamentally, and what's here to stick around? What's sort of a stopgap while we lived in this world? So I'm really pleased to have three really amazing speakers today join us to explore this topic. And with that, I'm going to start bringing us into that conversation, bring them into the conversation. So first up is James Arnott. He is from the Aspen Global Change Institute, and he's the executive director, and I'm very pleased to give him the floor again. He is a frequent guest with our webinar series because he spends a lot of time thinking about collaborative research and collaborative science and how to make it very effective and successful. So James, I will hand the mic over to you now.
Thank you, Doug, for the introduction. Hopefully you can hear me. Still mastering the unmute button even after a year of doing this every day. And thanks to all of you for joining. So I wanted to just tee up a few ideas, and this is somewhat of a recap from the webinar that we had in December last year, when we were providing results from a survey that the Neuroscience Collaborative collaborated on with 4 other funders of environmental collaborative research. And so in my introductory comments, I wanted to give some quick highlights from that survey and also point you to a link where a preprint of the results are now available for more extensive reading. But in a nutshell, what we did was we came together as a group of 5 funders to ask grantees who are midway through their collaborative research project when the pandemic hit, and to find out how that experience of adapting to the pandemic and physical distancing impacted their research and what they were also learning about the use of virtual methods. And so some of the findings that we gathered from that survey, we had about 45 responses in total, were not altogether surprising. For example, we found that almost all teams went almost entirely virtual after March 2020. More than half of the project teams used that opportunity to incorporate new technologies, particularly video technology, into their work. They reported that in some ways, moving to virtual methods added convenience and efficiency to their work, but they also noted the trade-offs of reduced ability to build new relationships, to make direct connections, to have the kind of spontaneity that occurs in in-person settings. So that, as a top level set of results, really was not altogether surprising. What was, I think, more provocative, at least for me, in terms of helping me rethink, I guess, how I think about collaborative research in general, came from a few other results. One was that we asked people about how participation had changed, whether their numbers of engaged participants went up or down after the start of the pandemic, and the results were really all over the map. And looking in depth into the results, it started to raise this question of what does it really mean to be a participant in a collaborative research project? If you are able to reach a much larger number of people but not engage them at the same level of depth, how do you evaluate that change in quantity and quality? There are results that suggested that while engagement with some types of stakeholders went up by being able to leverage the convenience and efficiency, other groups of stakeholders, for example, low-income groups, were very difficult to engage using virtual methods and created some real fundamental constraints. And that actually started to get us thinking a lot more of how do we examine collaborative research through a lens of equity and inclusion, and not just assume that because we're bringing a collaborative spirit to the table, that it will necessarily translate that way into being more equitable or inclusive. Maybe not, it should not have been surprising, but I was actually surprised to hear how much the distractions related to the pandemic, aside from technology, were influencing the virtual experience. For example, access to childcare, added work responsibilities, lack of adequate workspace predominated the set of distractions relative to access to internet, correct virtual platforms, bandwidth, and so forth. And so it really raised questions for me about what kinds of resources should be allocated to support participation in collaborative research. And I think what I'll just close by saying is looking at 2020 to evaluate how we move forward with virtual methods of collaboration. I think we need to be somewhat limited in what we draw, because 2020 was such a year of extremes in so many ways. And so I think we'll start to learn fresh as we move into 2021, hopefully have opportunities to come back together, explore hybrid modes of collaboration. And I don't think we should only draw lessons from 2020 to inform how we move forward. So I'll pass it back to you, Doug.
All right, thank you so much, James. That's a wonderful opening space. Next, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jessica McIntosh. Jessica is the Coastal Training Coordinator at the Rookery Bay Research Reserve in Naples, Florida. And in this role, she connects diverse stakeholders and collaborative research groups. She's worked in a variety of coastal management issues, ranging from invasive lionfish in the Cayman Islands, they taste delicious, by the way, to bioremediation for oil spills in salt marshes in Louisiana, and has held positions with academic, nonprofit, and government groups. So Jessica will lead us into another perspective on this topic. Take it away, Jessica.
Thanks, Doug. Good afternoon, everybody. Anybody ever comes down to Southwest Florida where I'm located, I would definitely invite you to try some lionfish. They are definitely delicious. So I am located at the Rookery Bay Research Reserve in Southwest Florida. You can see a picture here of our beautiful reserve with a barrier island, and our habitats are dominated by mangroves, so we do differ a little bit from some other reserves. You can see in the background of the picture the community of Marco Island, which borders our reserve. And we also differ from many other reserves in that we are fairly large. We manage 110,000 acres in Southwest Florida. So we have staff that actually do the stewardship, natural resource management of those resources. And I work really closely with that group as a primary audience for our collaborative work. So I'm going to see if it advances. Great. So today, I think my perspective is a little bit different than the other panelists, that I'm here to really share that on-the-ground perspective from one of the reserves as a practitioner at Rookery Bay. And because of maybe that more, on-the-ground approach, I also am talking a little bit in this kind of introductory part about which tools that I've found have worked and why I think that they have worked so well. So my experience in working in virtual platforms started a couple of years ago with this group, the Mangrove Coast Collaborative. And so that is a partnership between Rookery Bay and the Hobos Bay Research Reserve, which is located in Puerto Rico, and some research scientists primarily out of Florida. And we have been lucky to be able to do some site visits and in-person exchanges, but a lot of our work internally with the project team has been virtual. We started off with just conference calls and quickly switched over to virtual video conference calls for the team. And that was requested by some of the staff in Puerto Rico where English is their second language. And so they said that having the video and those cues of body language and being able to see exactly who was talking was really helpful. So I have a couple of years of facilitating some collaborative processes virtually. But of course, in 2020, I got a lot more experience. So we all know, as James said, in March, everything kind of switched, and I got more experience than I ever thought that I would running virtual collaborative processes and helping other staff, other partners, other end users also learn how to use those platforms was a big piece of that as well. So I was lucky that I had some experience going in, but I have definitely learned a lot more, and I'm happy to share with you guys today kind of some of those things that I've learned. But I think the big takeaway for me is in a virtual space to keep things simple. I think we talk a lot about the bandwidth of the internet, but I think people have a real mental bandwidth as well. And so in these virtual spaces, I've seen a lot of things where I think there's a kind of a desire to take things more complicated because you can with all these great virtual tools. And I think just going back to the basics and really keeping things as simple as possible is a key thing that I have learned and that I have experienced. And so along with that, I typically am using Zoom for my collaborative meetings and work that I'm doing. And I think a lot of the platforms have kind of started to have a lot of the same functions. So usually I'm looking for kind of 3 major functions that I'm using. I like breakout rooms. It allows people to really make some human connection that they're missing and have some other conversations. The chat box is great for people to be able to share that are maybe more comfortable writing. And then a virtual whiteboard or slides to share so people have some type of visual to follow along with, I think are kind of my 3 go-tos. And anything beyond that can start to get really complicated. And I think really carefully about who my audience is and who's involved in that collaborative process to ensure that things aren't getting too complicated and we aren't losing people by just having so many different windows open, or say somebody's joining on their phone from the field, that they'll still be able to follow along. And I also just want to mention briefly that we are going to talk in the discussion about 2021, what that's going to look like and beyond. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting in person with my colleagues again. This is a picture that I have from a workshop that we did at Hobos Bay with some of their key partners. And I think a lot of people are really hungry for that type of human connection that, fingers crossed, we're going to get back to pretty soon and be able to do this type of work. So I'm excited to share more with that as we get into the discussion, but I will go ahead and turn it back to Doug. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Really appreciate that reserve perspective from out in beautiful Florida. I'd like to bring in Susi now, Susi Moser. Great, she's already popping up here. Susi's work focuses on adaptation and climate change and science policy interactions and communication and the psychosocial resilience in the face of traumatic and transformative challenges associated with climate change. She's a geographer by training and has contributed to the IPCC in multiple capacities. That's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And over the past 5 years, Susi has partnered with different reserves to develop indicators of successful climate adaptation. She is another frequent guest on our webinar series as she presented some fantastic resilience metrics late fall last year. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our YouTube channel and view that webinar. And Susi is going to be bringing us a different perspective looking towards the future as well. So Susi, I will hand it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. And hello, everyone. It's great to be back in one of these webinars. And I guess what I want to start out with for just to seed the conversation, if you will, is something that's a little bit beyond what James just offered and what Jessica went into. The way I would characterize what James offered is to kind of give us these big patterns, few of which, as he himself said, sort of surprise us anymore. This is what we all experience. And he looked beyond the National Estuarine Research Reserve System to get at some of these patterns, whereas Jessica was really focused in on here's what we're doing, and just gave one example of what works in that context. This year, and this is something that the Science Collaborative does a lot, we want to put the finger on the pulse of the reserve system to see what are these challenges specific to the reserve system. Is there something unique here? And help each of you and really those beyond the system to learn from the system what is working, what are the challenges, how do we address them, and share that back out. I know we all have the annual meeting and obviously sector specific ways of learning with each other, but oftentimes what is learned in one sector might not be shared necessarily with the other, or you miss something that is happening in one particular reserve. So what we're doing this year, and really since the pandemic began, is to try to understand in more detail, following the newly funded projects, how are you doing this? How are you doing collaborative research and in this virtual environment, in this multi-stressor environment, as both Jessica and James already laid out. It's not just the pandemic per se, it's the economic strains that many of you experience because of shortages in budget now in your organizations or in your states. It's the personal challenges on top of that, whether that's illness related or simply childcare, teaching, and everything else that you now do. But also, you work in really challenging environments sometimes, where the problems are getting worse. You now have possibly less funding among your partners and stakeholders. How does that influence what is possible? How does that change the tension in the room about, how you do engagement or how you do this collaborative research? What are the possibilities? How has that space shrunk maybe? And so we're following each of these projects that are just now launching over the course of their evolving nature, and see what can we learn, and then share that back with the system. And really seeing how you're addressing or managing adaptively in this very challenging environment, and really not leave that context, the nuances of context, whether you are in Puerto Rico versus in Texas versus Florida versus Massachusetts versus California, wherever you are. Right, so to kind of just really get at the nuances of the context as well, and how that influences what you do. So we're going to share that back with the reserve system, and of course then with the world more broadly. And I look forward to hearing from you. What are the kinds of things you would want to learn from those reserves? And please add that to either in the chat here or online. Nick shared a spreadsheet where you can put in some notes. So if you want to share any questions that you want to learn about, please tell us now. You're helping in the co-design, if you will, of this particular internal system-specific study. With that, Doug, I'll give it back to you and we'll get into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Susie. And in that vein of hearing from you, I'm going to ask Nick to throw up a poll as we're bringing our panelists in. And this question is very simple. How are you collaborating with your partners? And we'll give you a few seconds, or 30 seconds to respond to this, and just sort of start sinking into what's working for you of these four, or what's happening right now in your space. And I did notice that our panelists have come on, so when we come back from this poll, I'm looking forward to starting our conversation. So Nick is our driver, and he will tell us when there's something available.
I'll go ahead and share it now.
All right. Yeah, there you go. So a very strong majority, and I guess this is not too much of a surprise at this very moment, virtually only as 92%, and some very small percentage of a kind of hybrid, and then some that are not able to collaborate with partners right now. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us. And so I think that's sort of a great lead into a first question I'd like to throw to the panel, which it sort of starts to expand on what all three of you have mentioned from your different perspectives. And that is, can you address how these both technological and non-technological issues have been affecting collaborative efforts? I mean, I think we've all started to scratch at it, and probably intuitively we know it, but it's always nice to sort of hear that explicitly described. So does anybody want to take a quick stab at, or to start the conversation on that topic? So how technological and non-technological issues may be affecting collaborative efforts from a process perspective.
Well, I can start it out, Doug. What I have been thinking about is that our experience bringing on and saturating a new technology into collaborative methods, collaborative research approaches in the past year has not so much created new issues in research collaboration, but rather exposed issues about participation that have always been present. And so, for example, the way in which participation as a concept itself creates some, if it just on its own does not level a playing field for everyone to contribute. And of course, we've seen a much less even playing field across the board in our society since the start of the pandemic, but it is expressed also in terms of who can and can't participate or participate well in collaborative research when we move virtual. So I think in some ways we're really just learning more about what we need to attend to in all aspects of collaborative research, not just specific to when we have an opportunity to use virtual technology.
I really like that, how you opportunity there that you've mentioned. Jessica, you had a great graphic. Keep it simple, stick to the basics. What are your thoughts coming from where you're sitting there in Florida?
I mean, I agree with what James just said, is that it might seem different, but it really isn't different. I mean, we think about who's maybe not at the table. And so maybe now we're thinking in this virtual world about how do we give them access to the internet? Do we need to have Wi-Fi hotspots or like a hub where people can join in? Do we need to use the right platforms for them to be able to participate? But I mean, those are the same questions that you'd be asking in a different way, even if we weren't virtual. What place should we have this? What time should we have it? And I think, again, it's not really a new issue, but it's just making sure that we are really asking those questions and making sure that either we are connected to those audiences and those people that we know need to be involved in these processes, or that we have partners and people that we're listening to that really do have that connection with that audience to make sure that we're making that connection. And yeah, I think it's something that is maybe exacerbated by the technology, but it's really just sticking with the same things that we've always done, of making sure we have those connections, we understand our audiences, and we're checking in with them to say, hey, why can't you join? What is the best way for you to join and participate in these collaborative processes is so key.
I'm going to pick up on something you said there about connecting with the audiences. Susi, one of the points I think that we've talked about a little bit prior to this is sort of the forming of new relationships in this virtual world. So how can that be stimulated in what we're doing, and what are kind of the pitfalls in that space when we're relying on virtual technology?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, especially from the projects that are just now starting that have not previously had connections to the stakeholders that they want to involve, or the partners that they are wanting to work with. For them, that seems to be a fairly big hurdle. And what I've heard in terms of what people do is get on the phone. It's the good old, technology of connecting one-on-one, which is much more time consuming. And I think, one of the implications of that is that we will need a lot more time in our timelines for the work that we do. I think what Jessica just pointed out was, how do you want to connect? How can you connect with people who have lower bandwidths in both ways, technologically and personally? I think it demands that we get a lot more creative and think really outside the box. The people who live in the warm climates have gotten already into these more hybrid spaces, right? Like, oh yeah, we are meeting outside, 6 feet apart. For those of us in the Northeast, like where I live right now, not so much, not at 18 degrees. So I think there are challenges, but I think that it really demands that of us, and particularly, those of us who actually do have the privilege. I think James's point about maybe rethinking how we spend what we used to spend on travel to spend that on paying people to participate is an important piece. The questions it raises for me is, when you do only this, when you do this long term, does that change the nature of what we're doing, how we're doing this? I don't think that's a foregone conclusion, whether that's better or worse, or it simply changes it. I don't think it's really clear how we can, what parts we can't do anymore, and maybe what things it opens up. I've heard research groups talk about, all of a sudden we have access to people who would never speak up in public, but in the privacy of a small break group, they show up, So there's some really interesting implications for the kinds of questions we ask, the kinds of collaborators we have. But I'm really interested in the question of how does this affect us long term? Growing up with only having masks over your face and never seeing your whole face, like, does that change the evolution of human beings? I don't know. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
I think you took us to a much different time frame than what we were thinking about. But James, did you want to add something to what Susie just said?
Oh, well, yeah, and I think this framing about like the technological issues and the non-tech issues, adding to the conversation, I think, in one sense, the pandemic and thinking about virtual collaboration over the last year has impressed that whether you're using Zoom or Teams is not the most consequential issue for society to hinge around, because we have so many other fundamental issues. And so, like, how do we get kids back to school is probably a more important challenge to resolve than how to use a Jamboard, for example. On the other hand, the fact that we have been moving and incorporating so many more technologies into our collaborative work this year, I think has made the choice of technology a much more deliberate and consequential part. And in the survey, I was just reminded in the survey we had feedback that when that didn't go well, for example, a team decided to adopt Slack as a new technology for quicker communication. And what happened was half the team started talking on Slack and half the team started talking by email, and it bifurcated the conversation, and I don't think in a positive way. And so I think maybe I'm just clarifying my comments that even though the choices about technology are not top of mind for many people that are trying to muddle through the experience we're going through right now, I think they should be an intentional and deliberate part of how we organize collaborative research moving forward.
Doug, can I just add one thing on this with the platforms? Sure. Do you have days when we just spoke about Zoom? Like, that seemed to be the only thing. And then all of a sudden now we're talking about, Zoom and Blue Jeans and Google Meet and Teams and whatever. It's like all of a sudden, and that's just the conferencing things, right? Or GoTo, whatever. And now we have, in addition to that, 17 different whiteboards and whatever. And all of a sudden I have a whole different set of conversations about the technology per se, which is, can't keep up with all these experimental new softwares that are coming out. And it's driving pretty much everyone crazy. I think we very quickly talk about an evolution. We very quickly need an evolution to, extinguish some of these so that we come back to being functional and not just learn yet another new software tomorrow.
Well, that's a good segue to the next question I want to explore, which is, we focus on technology quite a bit in this because I think it's easy to grab onto, and that's on a process side. But more on the content, because technology can get in the way or can also stimulate content development. What kind of topics would thrive with virtual collaboration? And when I was crafting this and thinking about it, there's some that we can easily just list off the top of our heads. What I want to do is go a little bit, kind of stimulate some different thoughts about what would really work in the virtual collaboration space that may not have been thought of before and going forward, because we'll get to the forward question next, but does anyone want to sort of I'm gonna pick on Jessica first, just because hearing someone mention 18 degrees weather is really, I want to go to Florida at the moment. But so Jessica, what do you think? What kind of topics do you think are really going to thrive and will continue to thrive with virtual collaboration?
Yeah, when I thought about this question, I was trying to think of more of the content, like sea level rise or prescribed fires or all these different topics that we talk about. But I think what I kept coming back to is that I really look at the scope of the topic. And so where I started working in a virtual way at the beginning was because the geographic scope really spanned across an ocean. So just us physically getting together made things so difficult to continue to have those conversations and to really get into the nitty-gritty details. And so I think in the past, the topics that I've seen really thrived in virtual collaboration was because they needed to happen virtually to really be able to get to that level of depth that they needed. And so I think, topics that are spanning across geographic regions, like, we do a lot of work with the Caribbean because we have similar habitats. And for us to physically get together has always been difficult. And so I think those things kind of lend themselves to virtual collaboration. And some other experiences I had pre-pandemic, we're bringing in collaborators that have a lot of experience maybe around, mangrove systems. There's not a whole lot of those in the continental US. So again, it's kind of spanning across the world because we have to really get that level of expertise and to bring all that knowledge together. So I think that's something that'll continue in the future.
James, what are your thoughts on Jessica's focus on the geography? What do you think?
Yeah, the geography was an aspect I hadn't thought of as much, and I think that's an important point. I don't have a sense that in terms of content or discipline or topic that there will be much of a distinction. Maybe there is, and it'd be very interesting to see if there are results about that. I think that a distinction might appear between performing collaborative tasks and doing deeper work of building and sustaining collaborations. And I think that what we've seen in terms of the last year is that at least the projects that I was looking at through the survey, they were largely able to maintain ticking off the boxes of their work plans that they had, using virtual methods to adapt. And there were trade-offs of doing that, like I said, about relationship building, trust building, engagement and productivity. I think it wasn't a perfect translation, but it was some level of continuity. I think that the deeper work aspect, and so I don't think it's more the axis of topic, it's more the axis of intensity. And I think when we get to the next question, we really talk about what's going to happen moving forward. I agree with I think Jessica earlier that we're really going to be so eager to get back and restore that social animal side within us that needs to be topped off, that we've really kind of running on to our reserve tank at the moment.
Social animals indeed. Susie, do you have anything you want to add to what James explored there?
Yeah, I want to add to that because that to me is a really curious thing. So in the age of Zoom funerals and Zoom births and those kinds of things, we apparently do some of these social aspects already. And they all freak us out, right, in some ways. And yet it's been one of the most interesting things for me to observe how we are trying to be those social animals, even though we have just been flattened to the visual interface. I mean, I hear it more and more, just what James was just saying about, oh, you know, it was fine for half a year to work out of my home. I'm really ready to meet other people again. But it's really curious to me how some people have figured out to bring in aspects that touch us through the screen anyway. So for example, to bring in music, to bring in poetry, to bring in silence. It's, you know, so this is not at all, this goes off of your topic question, right? But it's like, how do we actually bring in the human experience into it so that we build those trusted relationships when we don't already have it, so that we connect with each other on a deeper level. And those I have found to be some of the most interesting and creative ideas, actually.
Oh, Jessica, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to what Susie was saying, and I agree. Some people are really good at bringing that human component in, and it just dawned on me that a lot of times that's not about the technology at all. You know, we're talking about platforms, and it's really getting away from that technology almost and taking a step back, and like you said, having silence or just adding music in or adding these human components in. Again, it's not really anything new. It's just thinking about how you would have done that in person and putting it in. Is a good point, Susie.
So what do you all think is going to stick around as we go forward? And you know, we're kind of getting into this, and I think that's what I think what everyone wants to see. You know, you all have magic 8 balls, so or crystal balls, I suppose, not magic 8 balls. But you know, Susie, what do you think is going to be? You want to kick us off a little bit on this question? And actually, before you do, to the audience, please feel free to engage and put your questions into the chat box. We will have time to throw some questions to the panel here. So please feel free to put them in, and we'll bring them forward as we're going through. But while you're starting to come up with those questions, Susie, why don't you would you like to kick us off on our vision for the future?
Oh man, first you asked me about the crystal ball, now about a vision. I guess maybe the best I can do is questions. So one of the things I'm really curious about is, you know, we used to travel a ton. I recently realized that I haven't left my time zone in more than a year now. And I wonder whether or not we have gotten over the point of creating different social norms and expectations as to the travel, the amount of travel that we do. You know, especially for some of us traveling merchants in terms of the the kind of work that we do. What I anticipate is that, yes, we have changed that to some degree, but not entirely, and we will end up with a lot more hybrid situations, hybrid meetings, hybrid events, hybrid conferences, hybrid everything. And I wonder, I find those the most challenging. You know, it's one thing to be all in one room or all not in one room and being all over. It's much more difficult to somehow figure that out. So I think there is yet a new challenge coming, and I don't know yet how we handle that very well. I think the other piece that I want to maybe put out is, you know, we all think of this as this crazy disturbance that we lived through, and we will write the history books about it, and we all think that that was an exception. And my expectation is this is going to be the easy year. This is going to be the you know, when we had like only three crises, only 3 crises. I hope you can all hear the air quotes in that. I just have a feeling that this is going to be sort of our daily life, and how we actually manage in a increasingly distracted life, disrupted life, and yeah, with all the differences in how that affects our collaborators and us in different ways. That is something, at least, that keeps me up at night right now.
Crises is I'm going to grab onto that and just sort of think. Well, I'll invite James to sort of think about what kind of crisis management do you think is going to be, what will we be able to work with within the virtual space that we have now, and what's going to be working as we go forward?
Well, I mean, a question that I have, and I don't know really how to wrestle with, but it's inspired by Susi's comment about the crises, but also what I saw in the survey results, which was these oftentimes very personal issues that constrain the individual's ability to participate in a project of whatever form, but in this case, collaborative research. And so it may be childcare, it may be adequate workspace, it may be emotional or psychological care that is needed. And so as we interact in these professional environments, virtual or in person, in the midst of unfolding and accelerating stresses from many different fronts, how do we bring the personal into those conversations so that we can attend to it, but also respect the balance between work and life that I think many people want to try to maintain? So I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge that we sort out. In terms of the kind of going back to the main stem of the question, in my crystal ball, I don't know exactly what this looks like, but I think that in terms of technologies, we may have only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of the transformation. I mean, we're actually using it. I mean, this is GoToMeeting. It's been around for a decade or more, so we're not really using anything that's particularly new. But I recently read an article in a computer manufacturer's trade journal about what companies are developing for virtual interaction that already have prototypes or even commercial models available using holographic imagery, drones, robots that can be your avatar in different physical environments, virtual reality. And those are technologies I have zero experience with, but they are much more, they provide a much a radical different experience than what we're doing right now, which is actually not that much different, frankly, than what we've been doing before. We're just doing it a lot more often. So I think that we'll probably be seeing more of that, especially as we have the opportunity to do these hybrid meetings, which I really agree with Susi. It's going to be a big, tough nut to crack.
So as you said, the holographic part, I'm just picturing Star Wars right now, and you know, I don't know, it'd be fun to be Yoda somewhere, be projected across the end of the galaxy. But I'm going to bring us right back to Jessica instead of going off into space. You know, what do you think, Jessica? What do you see sticking around? You know, James has mentioned hybrid. Susi's mentioned hybrid approaches. We have holographic images. So in between those spaces, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it sounds much more fun to go off into space, you know, than to be in another webinar. But for the question, and I'm gonna totally agree with what Susi and James said about hybrid approaches. I think we're gonna see a lot more of that. There's gonna be a lot more of a demand. It's gonna require kind of relearning everything probably again from my perspective. We at My Reserve have already started to look into the technological needs that we're going to have to be able to do hybrid events well. So that's one thing that I'm kind of looking at on the ground. And one other thing, as you know, Susi and James were talking about like getting back to in person and travel, and I think Susi was bringing up, you know, people that have a lot of travel commitments and what's that going to look like. Are they going to want to try to, you know, do virtual to bring some of that that time commitment down? From my perspective, as somebody that, you know, is an employee with a state agency, I know that budgets are going to be tight moving forward, and I'm curious to see what travel budgets are going to look like. Or now that, you know, we've seen, hey, you can do this virtually, do you really need to travel to that conference, and how to justify some of those things? And I think a lot of people really understand the importance of those face-to-face interactions and those relationships. But when, you know, you come down to budgets, I think some of those things maybe will get forced to transition to virtual, whether we want it to or not, or to stay that way. And another thing that I'm thinking about along those lines is, you know, I think James was saying we're going to crave those face-to-face interactions so much. From my perspective at one of the reserves is looking forward, maybe I'll really start to work a lot more closely face-to-face with my partners that are here, that are local, that we can just, you know, drive 30 minutes up the road to get together for a meeting, that those partnerships might become even tighter when we can get back in person. And some of the more distant relationships might, lose some steam for a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see. Who knows? I never thought at this point that I would still be sitting here in my house working every day at the computer, but we will see where the future takes us. I'm hopeful that it's going to be a positive experience.
I like the optimism, and let's hold on to that. We're having a very vibrant string of questions coming in, and we have 10 minutes left. So I prefer to have a dialogue, but I might be a little bit more constraining because there's some really great questions coming in. So I'm going to start tossing these up now. The first question, curious, have any of you found traction with art-based methods in the virtual space? I might throw that to Jessica, working with partners in the reserves.
I don't know that I can say that I have. Our education team definitely has started to bring some art into their work. We were able to work with a local filmmaker as well in a webinar, which is really interesting, just seeing his approach and to how it's so different to what I do, which is much more process driven. And one kind of art piece that we do bring in a lot of times at the beginning of meetings, playing music. We have a great documentary that filmmaker made. It's the Southwest Florida Mangrove Coast. It's on PBS. You can stream it if you want something new to watch. You're out on Netflix. But we play clips from that video a lot to start meetings off or for breaks, just to kind of help people reconnect with nature, to see that beautiful film and to listen to some nice soothing music is a connection we've made.
Nice. Susie or James, any art in your space? And you can say no. We've got a lot of questions, so don't feel obligated.
No, but I'd love to see more examples, but I don't have any to offer.
Okay.
I see a lot of art, but not for engagement. It's, or at least what I've come across. I see it mostly as, like Jessica just described, to give people a break or to simply make art accessible now via the internet, but I don't see it so much as this interactive art as a part of the engagement process. That might be out there, I just haven't seen it.
Well, then TBD, but picking up on that engagement word, is another question from our audience. What strategies have you used to engage and integrate new employees or collaborators to your teams when they can't meet in person? It's a really great question.
Well, I'll just jump in because I've brought on 2 new employees to my team at the Aspen Global Change Institute since the start of the pandemic. And I don't have a list of the activities on hand, but some of the strategies that improv comedy classes use to help get people to express spontaneity and kind of get outside their normal rhythm have been really a big hit in our virtual staff retreats that we've done. And I think there's a lot to learn from that space of improv comedy.
I love that. We've gone Star Wars and now we're back at comedy. This is for the audience. This is collaborative. We're co-designing this as we're going. I hope I'm using that word right.
Can I just say one quick thing about that? So I think because we're all virtual, we now assume that's just all we do. We sometimes almost skip over the need to do introductions and things like that. And when you bring in new people, I think to actually create a space for them, and maybe more space than you would give, everyone gets like 1 minute or one little chat, whatever, to say where they are, but actually really invite them with some spaciousness into the new environment. Again, it adds another layer of time that you need, but I think that's really important because it's so difficult to get a sense for people, how they are, who they are. We're missing so many dimensions of the human experience. So I think it requires attention and intention.
Intention, yeah. I'll just add with my own experience. I came to NOAA in August, so there hasn't been an office for me to go to. So personally, what I've been doing is setting up one-on-one chats video not required with some of my coworkers across the country, and getting to know, sort of no note taking. Let's just talk. Let's just kind of get to know each other a little bit, and it's been really helpful in becoming part of a much bigger team. So it takes a little effort and time, for sure. But I'm gonna pull that thread a little bit more about strategies that build community or collaboration and have relied on having to be in one place. So, you know, a contentious issue and having strangers come together in one location. Do you think that engagement is still possible, or is it just going to take more time? Again, we're kind of circling around this time issue to build that trust.
It's a huge issue coming up, to build the trusted relationships, particularly when you actually start from a place of conflict. I think that what's actually really interesting, you know, and probably we should be looking to people like conflict mediators or therapists, couples therapists or whatever, to kind of learn from them of how they do it. I think there's an opportunity to do this really well, because it gives, you know, each person, each party, space and equal space to make their case, whatever, and to be not quite as reactive as you might be when you're right there and you might just, you know, really want to get into the conversation. So, but I think I think this is a real opportunity for us to learn conflict mediation skills, all of us who are in the facilitation business.
This is just reminding me, as a plug, if you haven't seen the Youth Poet Laureates reading yesterday at inauguration, the 3 words that she said define our time is to reconcile, rebuild, and recover. And I think that really speaks. I mean, even if we're re-engaging in person with people of similar backgrounds or belief systems, and there's not as much reconciliation to do, I think throughout our whole lives over the next 12 months to year, a multi-year long project is, I think, really going to be defined by those terms. And I think that we'll likely figure out how to do some of those aspects virtually, either by force or just by preference. But that'll increasingly become part of the in-person experience that we'll have to learn how to grapple with.
Jessica, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, in terms of conflict, I mean, I was thinking about that when we talked about the second question of what topics might not lend themselves to collaboration, and I didn't bring that up because I think it probably is going to take more time and being really intentional, like Susie was mentioning, but I don't think there's any reason that, you know, you can't have those hard conversations virtually. And in terms of, you know, building the trust and new partnerships, I think it's just being really mindful and setting aside the time for it.
I really like that. And unfortunately, we are running out of time, and there's four more questions. So to the audience members who submitted those, what we'll do is we'll be providing these questions to the panelists and getting answers in their dialogue, and then posting these on the website. So please don't think that your questions have not been heard. There are some really good ones that we'd love to get their input on. And so I'm going to hand it back to Nick. Before I do that, I really want to thank the audience for attending today. James, Jessica, and Susie for giving us some insight and perspectives. And Nick, you can take it away. And everyone, please stay safe out there as we go forward into this new year.
Thanks, Doug. And also, my webcam was having some issues, so we'll just leave it off. Just to echo what Doug said, just thanking everybody for attending, and thank you to our panelists for putting such great thought and insight out for us all to chew on and mull over. Looking ahead to next month, we have another webinar scheduled on Tuesday, February 23rd, 3 to 4 Eastern time. That is on understanding the interconnectedness of climate change, salt marsh resilience, and nuisance mosquitoes. And we have currently a team of speakers from Rutgers and the Jacques Cousteau NERRS who are going to present for us. And I believe that is it for announcements. So again, just a big thank you, and I hope you all stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.